So, with AI promising to direct, each and every team member to the right target at the right time, it does sound like a dream come true. But when we look a little bit closer, when we go under the bonnet a little bit further into detail, we realize that actually AI systems are not created equal. We know that accuracy and quality of the intelligence are key, but also is the way that the intelligence is delivered. And given the vital role that these systems will play in managing your teams over the next, 5 to 10 years even, getting this right the first time is absolutely essential. And it's essential because we want to avoid further disillusionment on how technology can actually support the people in the field, right? Because as Paul said, we've already seen some of that. So before I go into the detail, I want to introduce Jane. Jane is a character that I'm going to use to try and explain some concepts. Imagine that she is a rep or an MSL in your organization, and she is actually the person that we're trying to support. So I think firstly, just to echo your point, Paul, you're absolutely right that the external environment has changed significantly. The uncertainty that the pandemic has given, the huge volume of data that's now being generated, the rapid digitization that we're still basically trying to navigate through. It's given rise to a lot of new trends, a lot of kind of technology, but next best action is one that is rapidly taking over the life science industry. So let's just imagine for a second what Jane has to deal with, right? A field-based MSL now has to contend with a computer, essentially, that has been deployed to assess and analyze this wealth of data, absorb this information, and spit out recommendations, directing her to the most intelligent single move that she can make. And that sounds smart, right? And I'm sure, Jane's manager absolutely loves it. But from an employee perspective, it could be the beginning of the end, right? Especially if it's done badly. And my personal opinion is that in the vast majority of cases, it is being done badly today. So currently, the majority of systems are barking out a single instruction, right? This is what you should do today, Jane. Send an email because you haven't sent one for 3 weeks, or go and see Dr. X because you haven't seen them for 3 weeks, based on rules. And worse still, a lot of them are black boxes. There's no real reasoning or evidence alongside that kind of recommendation that someone like Jane could actually use to validate where it's come from. So these human rules are largely inflexible. They're not really data-driven, but they're there to guide Jane. But it's kind of a bit of a lose-lose situation in many ways. So we know, though, from history and maybe countless examples that we've all come across, that when there is a lack of understanding or alignment between kind of authority and staff, it leads to resentment. Someone like Jane would start to distrust these recommendations. Distrust leads to poor adherence. Jane stops using the system. Finally, she probably feels a sense of injustice because she's had no real say in the tool that has been deployed to help her. So what's the solution to this problem? And that's the question I'm going to pose today. How can we deploy human-centric AI solutions that truly empower people like Jane, but longer term, not just for this next best obsession that we have? And how do we go further to use this to kind of close performance gaps between the top 20% and the rest of our field force, de-risk business from events like the pandemic, helping new starters have an impact from day one, and managing the entire life cycle of the brands, pre-launch, launch, and further on. So I'll just touch on what I call the old world, because we clearly have moved into a new world now. And I think over the last decade, and probably even longer, based on my discussions with pharma, there is a sense that field reps, MSLs, like Jane, have probably lost some level of confidence, some level of control, even power in their roles, right? And it stems from 3 key areas. I think the first one is outdated KPIs, and it's one that I want to talk about. If we're measuring Jane with outdated KPIs, given the leaps and bounds that we've made as an industry, and only the last 8 months really shows how fast we can move when we want to, yet call frequency, percentage of calls on target customers, delivery of a key message, i.e. rules-based, tends to equate success. But now we have this technology, AI, machine learning, and it can play a massive part in changing the way we look at these KPIs, because we can actually learn what is driving outcome, both for Jane and for the stakeholders, the HCPs, based on the sensitivity of their needs. we know that the job has changed, right? We know the amount of upskilling that has been required, disease knowledge, funding knowledge, pathway knowledge, etc. But when you couple that with huge volumes of data, rapid digitization, we start to see the problem. Someone like Jane has to focus or distill down from thousands of actions down to the most important actions. But traditional KPIs don't encourage that, and therefore there is this mismatch between what smart AI solutions can bring and then the KPIs that we will use to kind of measure success. The second point I probably want to talk about is technology. I'm sure that someone like Jane is tired, actually, of the amount of technology we've thrown at her and expected her to improve in terms of her performance just by adding technology. And the problem here is that technology today has by far superseded the technology of the past. But our investments, I believe, have left us fearful of change. We would prefer, as an industry, to probably bolt on some kind of module to an existing system from an existing vendor, maybe give Jane a half-baked offering, and I say that respectfully, but rather than selecting and making the difficult decision to pick the right intelligence, so actually we increase the chances of success. And that's what has led to significant amount of disillusionment, and why team members like Jane are misaligned with actually how technology can actually help them on a day-to-day basis. And if you think about field teams today, the goal is to shorten that time to impact, right? Whether it's MSLs or reps. And we need to ensure that as a technology company, we are aligned to that goal. And someone like Jane would, as I said, needs to focus on the priority activities, regardless of whether that is face-to-face or on a virtual call. For me, that is secondary. Before that step, we must give them the information and the evidence at their fingertips to actually allow the right conversation to happen in the first place. And that leads me to my third point on data. What I want to say here is that I think, firstly, people like Jane are not data analysts and actually don't want to be. They don't want to be knee-deep in dashboards and knee-deep in data. Yes, they need to possess the skill set to kind of meet the demands of the role, and we know that, but they would rather us support them through AI by learning from the wisdom of the past to help guide future decisions and pinpointing that valuable information that will actually reduce that time to impact. And that is how we need to use data to build the trust between people like Jane and the systems that we want them to use. And it's this trust that will then actually reinforce improved data capture, improved outcomes, and ultimately, we need to do this through empowerment. So what do I mean by empowerment? I've got on here that true transformation comes from change in behavior, and this is exactly something that OKRA have seen through the deployment of our own systems. But the analogy I'm going to use is one that we've probably kind of all heard of, about an individual who's hungry, right? So we can choose to feed that person for a day, right? Which is probably equivalent to giving Jane a single instruction, go visit this account or go visit this KOL, regardless of if it goes against everything that she wants to do. And that's the next best action. That's the order I'm giving, no real evidence, just rules, and let's blindly follow it. But if we can teach Jane to fish, which would be the equivalent of using data to provide a suite of ongoing evidence-based recommendations and actions, that's likely to empower Jane far more to make intelligent decisions. And that is what is now possible through intelligent application of AI. And I would say that as industry leaders listening into this webinar and on the panel and decision makers, we must demand more than a single next best action for someone like Jane. A suite of recommendations that must be explained, distilling down to the most important actions that can be taken. Because for Jane to truly change her behavior out in the field, she needs that evidence to know where those insights and suggestions have come from. And I think that's what we need to be aiming for, and not just kind of AI, regardless of the long-term effect. We cannot bypass human intelligence by barking what I call instructions and orders in these rule-based systems. We need to unlock Jane's intelligence and stimulate that intellectual decision-making for the long term. So coming to a close in a second, but just to move away from Jane for a moment, how do we get to those insights, right? I mentioned earlier on that we have different types of AI. They are not equal. And there's systems that are being deployed today that are rule-based, right? And they are inferior. They use guidelines and parameters and rules to work within to figure out what to do next. And this seems on the outset like a scalable option, right? Rules are rules, what can go wrong? But many of these systems require huge human input. They aren't flexible, they sit within black boxes, and sometimes even include concepts such as premium algorithms versus standard algorithms. I mean, why anyone would have a suboptimal standard algorithm to help the teams is something that, you know, I can't really comprehend. So we need to get to that deep AI, that evidence, that explainability. And another analogy I'll use quickly is, it's a little bit like adding stabilizers kind of onto a child's bike to stop them falling over, right? But it's easy to understand if that was rule-based AI that, you know, someone's never going to win the Tour de France, for example, with stabilizers on their bike, because that will stop them from becoming an elite cyclist. And rule-based systems are similarly unable to become as smart as we require. We know that deep AI is more difficult to create, and these systems are more difficult to validate. But once we've done that and we've developed the ground truth from data and not rules, they will quickly supersede their counterparts for the long-term benefits that we're trying to get to. And then, as you can see here, we have kind of a diagram illustrating how we get to that empowerment through explainability. And essentially, the point here is that the best-in-class systems do this, right? Alongside your prediction engine, your suggestion engine, and the data's coming from the public domain and from the client domain, it is the explainability engine that pinpoints what is driving outcome. Whether it's looking at causality, correlation, which is a complex process, we must keep it a glass box approach, turning that into humanized, digestible outputs that people like Jane can actually understand. What are the suite of actions that I can take next, and why? And that's the key difference between technology that doesn't get used and is not trusted with technology that will get used, that will get trusted, and can actually stand the test of time, because AI is here to stay. And I'll just conclude with the last slide and bring it kind of all to an end on some of the key points that I've raised around explainability and empowerment, closing the loop from then actions taken by these individuals, deep AI versus rules, the notion that rules can lead to scale and the other can't. But for true transformation, it's about behavior. And I think what I want to say at the end, I think we're all aspiring for a future where companies can feel confident that their field teams are aware of the actions they need to take ahead of time, almost like a sixth sense. And that's more important now than ever, given the pandemic, given the data generation, given digitization. And it's that sixth sense that will provide that competitive edge, but through systems that are objective, that are seen as an assistant, that are seen as bringing back control, bringing back confidence, bringing back power and consistency in terms of the recommendations.